Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Jayne. I'm the membership manager here at SES. And for anyone who's not so aware of us, we're the national intermediary for social enterprise in Scotland. So we are here to champion social enterprise, promote, support, and connect social enterprises across Scotland. Part of our role is around representation. And it's about keeping members informed of policy developments. So first of all, I want to thank you all for taking the time to come along to the session today. It's important to us as a representative body that we are reflecting as well as we possibly can the kind of views and aspirations of our members in the wider social enterprise community. So we're here today to look at government's current consultation on a human rights bill for Scotland. Human rights affects everyone. It's a fundamental right for everyone, particularly important to the vulnerable and excluded people that many social enterprises exist to serve. And I was particularly struck by a quote at the beginning of the consultation document from a member of the lived experience panel, which I imagine our speakers will talk a little bit about later, and who said that if human rights is implemented correctly, then there are big benefits for communities of people who have been historically denied their rights and discriminated against. So, you know, I think we can all get on board with that. We're really pleased today to be joined by speakers from Scottish Government who are going to take us through the Human Rights Bill consultation. If we could all keep our mics off while the presentations are on, that's great. It's a short session today, so I really hope there's going to be time at the end for any questions and perhaps a bit of discussion. However, do please use the chat function to introduce yourself if you've got any questions to put forward, and if you've got any thoughts or suggestions to share, anything that you'd like us to include in our consultation response. So I'm just going to hand over to, I think, Joe. Joe's up first, Joe McKeown from Scottish Government, Engagement Manager at Scottish Government. And hopefully our presentations, your presentations will work well. Joe, over to you.
Thank you. No, thanks very much, Jayne. That was great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. Can I just check, can you hear me okay? Can I get some waves? Yeah, brilliant. And hopefully you can see the slides. We've had a lot of fun in the last 5 minutes making sure that those work. So we'll see how we go. So today we're going to do is a pretty high level run through of what's in the consultation document. So we've done this quite a few times now for different audiences, and we're very conscious that we go quickly through some pretty, certainly we find them quite complex, and so, you know, we could spend hours picking apart the consultation. In fact, I'll just but I'm getting ahead of myself. What I should say first of all is that my name's Joe McKeown. As Jayne said, I'm the one of the engagement managers for the Human Rights Bill team. I'm very happily joined by my colleagues Becky and Kiren, who are on the policy side of the bill team, working on some really key areas, such as the incorporation approach that we're actually using to create the legislative framework for the rights that we're looking to build into the bill, the role of dignity, the role of private actors, how all that plays across the bill. So I think it's really good that we've got them here. I think that'll be some of the areas where you'll have lots of questions that we're keen to get into. So I'll try and move on. So yeah, as I say, purpose today is to do a very quick high-level overview of what's in the bill. And we'll also talk a wee bit, I'll come in at the end and talk a wee bit about the sort of routes into the consultation, because there's a few accessible ways in for if you don't want to sit with this big tome. So that's the consultation here. We launched it on the 15th of June last year. Oh no, this year. What am I talking about? Sorry, no, with my coffee. And I think, as kind of set out in the consultation, the ideas and proposals in this are very much informed by quite a lot of work that's taken place over the last kind of 2-3 years. You'll see reference in there to the First Minister's Advisory Group on Human Rights Leadership. That was around kind of 2019 to 2020, I believe. And then following that was the First Minister's Task Force for Human Rights Leadership, which was comprised of a number of civil society organisations, academics, people from legal background, human rights institutions in Scotland, and they produced a report in 2021 of 30 odd recommendations for what should be in this bill. So you'll see that kind of throughout the consultation document. We refer back to the recommendations in the task force report as kind of the grounding ideas for what we're trying to achieve. And we're going to talk about some of that stuff today. So what I'm going to start with, I'm going to pass to my colleague Kiren, who's going to kind of talk through, first of all, the treaties that we're looking to actually incorporate into this bill and why. And I think it's helpful if I just kind of frame this as, we've taken a lot of feedback about what people have told us about how we're getting through this material, and I think people kind of wonder how this connects to the other stuff we'll come and talk to at the end around implementation. So I think it's worth kind of fleshing out that we're going to go through the sort of legislative framework that we want to build in law first. So how we will actually put words on the page, craft the text of a bill, as it were, that will create the legal effect of realizing some of the more concrete routes to implementing better human rights that we'll come on and talk to after. But it's really important that we talk about this stuff and give it its space, because it does have, it does relate to how the kind of real world impacts of the bill are felt. So let's, I think Kiren is going to start on the next few slides. Are you ready, Kiren? Or you want to come in and speak to those?
Yeah, of
Thank
course.
you. Just let me know when you want to move on a slide.
Yep, I will do. So, hello everyone. I'm Kiren Zubairi and I work in the Human Rights Bill team alongside Becky and Joe. And as Joe mentioned, I'll be taking you through what we're aiming to kind of achieve with the bill. So I'll start off with the treaties and rights we're looking to incorporate into the Human Rights Bill. So again, as Joe mentioned, in March 2021, the Human Rights Task Force published its report making around 30 odd recommendations for establishing a framework for human rights to bring internationally recognised human rights into Scottish domestic law. So the task force specifically recommended that the Scottish Government incorporate 4 international treaties. These are, and I'll try not mess up the words, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of a Person with Disabilities. Alongside these 4 international treaties, they also recommended including a right to a healthy environment. The recommendations were accepted in full by the Scottish Government, and here we are, we're now consulting on the Human Rights Bill. So if we could have the next slide, please. So here I'll talk about, what rights are we looking to incorporate? What do the rights look like? So what we're aiming to do is incorporate those rights from the international treaties or standards that we're looking at that are not yet contained within Scots law. So when I talk about economic, social, cultural rights, we mean things like a right to an adequate standard of living, including rights to food and housing, a right to health, a right to social security, a right to participate in cultural life. With regards to a healthy environment, we're looking to include things like clean air, safe and sufficient water for drinking, sanitation, agriculture, non-toxic environments in which to live, work, study, and play, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, as well as a safe climate overall. We also want to include rights expressed for the protection of women, disabled people, and people in groups who experience racism, and the intersections between these demographics, which is really important. If we could have the next slide, please. So what is it that the Human Rights Bill will do? So it will aim to give domestic effect to internationally recognised human rights standards by incorporating them into our Scottish legal framework. So it's drawing down these really large international treaties to a very Scottish context and into our legal system. So that will make these rights enforceable in Scots law for the very first time. It will create duties on those delivering public functions to deliver those rights and improve access to justice for people where rights are not upheld. So this has been a real whistle-stop tour of the kind of background into the rights, and I hope that we can kind of follow up on the different aspects later. But I'm going to hand over to Becky, who will talk us through compliance with the rights and who actually the rights and duties apply to. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Kiren. So we are on complying with the rights slide. So we are proposing that complying with the rights in ISESCR and right to a healthy environment in the bill will mean two things. Complying will require duty bearers to meet minimum standards and progressively realise the rights over time. But what does this mean? So meeting minimum standards means delivering the most basic parts of the right that help people to live with dignity. In the treaties, that looks like free primary education and freedom from hunger. The minimum standards for Scotland will be agreed through a participatory process after the bill. Progressive realisation means moving as quickly and as effectively as possible towards the full realisation of the right. In other words, continuous improvement. This can be done by taking concrete, targeted and deliberate steps towards fulfilling the right, gathering and using maximum available resources to fulfil the right, and ensuring no regression of the right, which means no rolling back on protections. So, in contrast, this is different to civil and political rights, which are either compatible or not. For example, you have a right to vote or you don't. These can't be progressively realised over time, which is why the duties for economic, social, cultural and environmental rights are being framed in this way within the bill. Next slide, please, Joe. So, duty bearers and private actors. So, we're proposing that the duties within the bill apply as far as possible to bodies carrying out devolved public functions of a public nature in Scotland. So, within the bill, we're going to provide a clear set of duties for public bodies, including, so far as possible, private actors who carry out devolved public functions in Scotland in relation to the rights of the bill. This is with the aim of ensuring, so far as possible, that the law, policy and decision-making by Scotland's public authorities and services contributes to the advancement of the full range of international human rights standards contained within the bill. So we're considering mirroring the UNCRC bill approach, that's the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child bill, which applies duties of that bill to private actors acting under a contract or other arrangements with a public body to deliver a public function. So this includes putting an initial procedural duty on public authorities and private actors delivering devolved public functions to build the rights into the fabric of their decision making. After this, it will move to a duty to comply with the rights for these public bodies and private actors when delivering devolved public functions. The duty to comply will be demonstrated by progressively realising the rights and ensuring the delivery of minimum core obligations. So we're carefully considering the outcome of the UNCRC bill reconsideration phases and developing our thinking in this area. So the duty for private actors carrying out devolved public functions could include, for example, private social care providers delivering care services on behalf of a local public authority, or a third sector organisation providing a service under contract with a public body. So we're hoping that from this you will be interested in the role of private actors under the bill, and we're really mindful that it might affect how new duties arise for social enterprise groups, for example, if working under contract by a local authority. The consultation doesn't set out a final definition of private actors, but as mentioned before, we are exploring the approach seen in the UNCRC bill. So basically today we're in listening mode and are interested to hear what you think about these proposals. We're keen to hear thoughts and hope that you'll be able to fill out a consultation response in this regard. We would also like to hear your thoughts on private actors within the UNCRC, if you have any, and if there are any good practice or lessons that we can learn about bringing views of this stakeholder group into the guidance of the bill, the human rights scheme, which Joe will talk about a little bit later on, and reporting. Next slide, please, Joe. So, protection of the equality treaties. So, we're proposing a different approach for ICERD, CEDAW and CRPD, otherwise known as the equality treaties, to help navigate the complexities of devolution. It's our view that the equality treaties could engage equal opportunities which are reserved to Westminster. The consultation proposes a procedural duty on duty bearers in relation to the equality treaties and an equality provision to ensure equal access for everyone to the rights. The provisions of the equality treaties would inform the interpretation of core ICESCR rights and the right to a healthy environment for those protected groups. I understand that we're going quite fast here, so for more detail on the equality provision, please see Part 6 of the consultation. So for the first time in our domestic legal framework, duty bearers will have to actively consider the rights in the equality treaties when making decisions and delivering services. This model will deliver a significant step change for the protection of rights of disabled people, women, and people who experience racism. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to come back in now and talk a little bit about the sort of routes that we're actually going to be implementing those rights. So there's a lot in the consultation on what we call access to justice. So it's been a really clear message we've heard from groups and organizations and individuals that we've met with in preparing these proposals, that, you know, the human rights that we're going to build into law can't just sit on the shelf. They need to actually be kind of something that has teeth, I think is a really useful phrase that we've heard in a few spaces, that has to be something that people can actually use to take actions when things go wrong. So there's a lot in the consultation which is very kind of crudely summarized here as non-judicial and judicial routes to remedy. And I'll talk a little bit about those. So probably, I think what's most important there is that what we'd like is the Human Rights Bill to help bring in much clearer kind of routes to getting things sorted when it goes wrong at the point of frontline complaints handling. So you'll see reference in the consultation to things like a human rights culture. So, and how we'd like to kind of embed a more positive human rights culture in Scotland. And a lot of that's informed by, Jayne, you mentioned the quote from the Lived Experience Board member at the start when you were talking. We met a lot with what we established. The Lived Experience Board was a group of people who were kind of drawn from different walks of life, but what kind of united them was that they each had each faced ongoing challenges kind of accessing their human rights in daily life. So we went to them and talked a lot about what's the current status quo, as it were. And they talked about how trying to claim your rights, certainly through things like the courts and complaints bodies, but even just at the point of frontline services, can so often feel like going up against a big complex system that's not necessarily on your side, it feels like sometimes. So one of the kind of chief means of improving access to justice for us is getting that frontline complaints handling better. That's part of that human rights culture. But having kind of routes to go, strengthened routes to go if that doesn't work, is also a key point. So we talk here about a clearer human rights remit for bodies that deal with escalated complaints, such as the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman. So there's a lot in the consultation about stronger role for that organisation, and also the Scottish Human Rights Commission as well. So we're talking about giving it expanded powers to do things like bring and intervene in civil cases and investigate systemic issues. So that's very much in response to what we're hearing, that people sometimes, people feel kind of left alone and to face this big complex system, that the routes to get kind of advice or support, or to escalate their complaints to other institutions, other bodies, can take far too long, and even then it's still a complex kind of challenge. So these non-judicial routes are about recognizing that people, when things go wrong, people don't really want to go to court if they can avoid it. That's should be the option of last resort. Having said that, there is some fairly tangible proposals in the consultation around strengthening the role of courts in identifying and taking action when human rights issues arise. So there's proposals in the consultation around how the courts can deliver remedies and deal with incompatibilities. And some of that comes back to what Becky was talking about, around how the way we build the laws into the legal framework affects how the courts will come to give them scrutiny when there are challenges. So we want to put a great emphasis on really clear and strong legislation that taps into existing sources of kind of guidance and scrutiny, so that courts have a lot of sources to draw on when they're coming to address human rights issues. But we also want to consider the court's approach to assessing reasonableness and standing. So that's who can bring human rights cases to court, to open that up to bodies like Scottish Human Rights Commission much more, and to make it more kind of accessible in terms of why court action is being taken. And we also want to do more around supporting access to things like advocacy, information, advice, and legal aid. Those were really, really key things that came through when we were talking with the Lived Experience Board and others around getting those things right. Would really help address that sense people have of human rights and claiming them through complaints processes and other bodies and through the courts as being this challenge that we need to address through this bill. So coming on to the next slide. So those are some of the more complex proposals around access to justice. Now, there's a lot there I mentioned about frontline services and changes to the human rights culture. So we're mindful that there needs to be really strong mechanisms implemented by this bill that give accountability to that, to transparency as well, so that everybody involved can actually see the effectiveness of what we're trying to do. So probably the chief thing to flag that's in the consultation is around what we're calling the human rights scheme. Now, that would be a specific duty on Scottish ministers to publish a report of its plans for implementation. Now, by publish, I mean it would be something that you'd be able to go online and access, but it would also be something that would, a bit like what is done under the UNCRC bill, laid before Parliament, so that it's formally given scrutiny by the Scottish Parliament. That could be in things like the committees or even in the chamber and debates and things like that. But it would also be there for public scrutiny as well. So the consultation sets out quite a few areas that could be captured in the human rights scheme that are relevant to kind of monitoring the overall progress of implementation. So we've got a few examples here: planning and reporting duties for public bodies, and we do anticipate there would be some form of reporting duty on public bodies that comes in under this bill. Information and awareness raising for rights holders, that's been a really key thing. Again, coming back to that idea of a human rights culture in frontline services, people tell us that what they would like to see is for people whose services they provide are how we access our human rights, that they are educated and trained to understand their function as human rights enablers. And that can go some way towards kind of addressing that sense of people responded badly to human rights language. But also, it's really important that there's education for human rights holders, for rights bearers, for all of us, so that we understand what this bill, the changes this bill brings in, and where to go and the new routes we have for accessing and claiming our rights, to name and claim our human rights. We also could cover capacity building and guidance for duty bearers. We're very mindful that that's a massive issue. So new reporting requirements, new legal duties on duty bearers. These have a, we're very aware that these have a resource implication attached to them. So capacity building and guidance is about making sure that they've got the resource requirements, the capacity to deliver on their new human rights obligations and duties, but also that they've got clear guidance that, for example, aligns what we're trying to do here with things like the public sector equality duty, with the UNCRC bill, and with other measures. And monitoring and reporting is also something that could be included in the scheme. Talked about that a little bit already, but it's about how do we bring in effective reporting that does not just sit as another kind of resource pool on duty bearers, but is actually something that we can kind of see the thread from reporting right through to identifying, using data and evidence where the systemic issues are, and that leading through to targeted action and targeted resource. So we're also thinking about how we would sort of reasonably commence each of the rights and duties in the bill. So the sort of procedural duties set out in the consultation are among the first that we envision would come into effect. And that would allow the sort of processes of kind of evidence gathering, capacity building to take place, so that after a determined time, the duties to comply would kick in, and then at that point we would have our minimum core obligations that Becky mentioned established, so we would know where the floor is, beyond which human rights could not be permitted to fall. And we would have our guidance in place so that we all understood across the system what our requirements were around delivering our duties and meeting our obligations on progressive realisation and other areas. So I think I'm coming towards the end now. So broadly, just to kind of sum up what the Human Rights Bill is about, like I say, it's about building and advancing on Scotland's human rights culture. It's about placing more of our rights at the centre of frontline service delivery, law and policy making, and about targeting resources so that we can better tackle human rights issues, which are the issues we deal with every day. These are poverty and inequality, and how we uphold dignity in everyday life as well. So very quickly, I just want to say a little bit about the consultation itself. It closes on the 5th of October. That's our contact email there. That gets right through to us in the Bill team. We can share that in the chat as well, and we'll share it after this event if that's helpful. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the accessibility materials that we've produced for the consultation as well, so that the best place to go for all this stuff in one place is our Citizen Space website. So from there you can complete the consultation online if you want, but you can also access the copy as well if you want to see that in PDF. We have an audio version, we have a Gaelic translation. We also have an easy read of that we've worked with the organisation Disability Equality Scotland to produce. We also have child-friendly materials as well. We've worked with a children's rights organisation together to produce a sort of pack that people can use if they want to have, if they work with children and young people and they want to have workshops to help inform a consultation response. We've also had a short guide to the bill, which we're civil servants, but we've had a go at plain English. And I know that's a contradiction in terms. But we think that kind of unpacks some of the concepts a wee bit more and just is a wee bit more approachable as maybe a first stop. And there's also a facilitator's guide as well. Again, if people want to host their own discussions with local groups or community groups that they work with to inform a consultation response, there's resources there to help them do that. And, our door is open. If there's other requirements, people can use that email address to contact us. So I think I'll stop there. But that was really, I hope that was really useful, and we're happy to take some questions with the time we've got left. And as I say, even if there's stuff that comes up after this, just fire us an email and we will try and help however we can. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. All right, thanks very much. Thanks, Joe, Kiren, Becky. I think, you know, that was obviously I realised that was an overview of what is an incredibly complex area, but obviously incredibly important if we're achieving justice and fairness and a human rights for everyone. Quite interested to hear how we're aligning policy and practice as well, because sometimes, you know, there can be that disconnect between what's in policy translating into practice. So yeah, thanks for sharing that with us. I have a question in the chat from someone who's had to leave, but obviously we will pass any information and answer over to him. And if anyone else has a question, if you could just raise a virtual hand, that would be great. But we'll ask Paul's question first of all. So it's around how Scottish Government envisages the enforcement of the new bill and how it may or may not affect the Employment Act, if at all. And I'm guessing because employment law is not devolved, is that right? So that's a Westminster area. Who wants to take that one? Is that you, Joe, or?
I'm happy to give that a go, but please shout up, Becky or Kiren, if you want to come in. So I suppose I think that's a really good question and a useful point to talk about how we're dealing with reserved matters in the bill. So the consultation talks a bit more about this, but we're essentially we're drawing down the rights in the international treaties, but in our approach to incorporation, we propose to use the direct text where we can, but to remove text in those treaties that's relevant to reserved areas. So I suppose this is not a specific question. This answer is not specific to the Employment Act, but I hope it's helpful in terms of all reserved areas. So we're very mindful of you know, the need to operate within the current kind of constitutional settlement, and you know, as you probably all be aware, you know, the UNCRC bill was challenged on some of those areas, and so we're very mindful that that's something that we need to accommodate within our approach to incorporating these rights. So that's having you know, we're picking up on that in conversations like these, in the sense that how do we then give effect to things like where the equality treaties talk about things that are kind of reserved under, you know, the Human Rights Act or the Scotland Act. And for us, the consultation sets out, you know, the emphasis we will give to those procedural elements of or the procedural duties that we want to put in place. So it will be about kind of giving evidence to those, particularly in how we in how duty bearers have to meet their duties to comply. Sorry, I'm possibly going off on a tangent, but the duties to comply will apply to the economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to a healthy environment. And they are the strongest duties that the bill will impose, and they are very strong. Now, the equality treaties, by that I mean CERD and CEDAW and CRPD, they will be the areas where there's more text removed because they kind of cut across reserved areas. So that's why I'm talking about we see how we give effect to that in the bill is through very strong procedural elements. So we'll be looking for duty bearers in meeting their duties to comply, reading across to the reserved to the equalities treaties, and giving consideration to those and how they meet their much stronger duties to comply. And that's why there's so much emphasis in the consultation on things like the human rights scheme and on effective reporting and monitoring. It's because it needs to be visible across the whole system that it's the full set of international treaties that is being considered in how duties are being met. So I think to sort of sum up, sorry, I know Paul's left, but that was a bit of a ramble, but it's a very good point, and I suppose I would put that back to yourselves, that if the Employment Act is an area of legislation that is relevant to social enterprises, and you've got thoughts on risks or opportunities and how it might interact with the Human Rights Bill, given what I've said and what's in the consultation, then we would love to hear about that in a consultation response, to be honest. All information about these tricky interactions with other legislation, especially reserved UK government law, that would be really helpful to us. I think that's a really good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Yes, and I guess that's coming back to us in terms of where social enterprises, sorry, excuse me, where social enterprises kind of engage with this bill and what are the pinch points for them. So yes, thanks. David, I see you've got your hand up. How are you doing?
Well, thank you. I kind of apologise for this question because I've been trying to get it for about a year, and basically it's kind of been ignored. But more to the policy side of things, given my background in politics, in regards to the gender reform bill that's obviously been knocked back, and then we got on to the idea of CEDAW. How do we define the idea of women here? And by using the wording of the current legislation, do we actually put an emphasis on restricting people from changing their identity? And will that cause issues for legal systems moving forward?
Right. Thanks, David. I'm sorry if you've waited a year for the answer to this question. There's no pressure on colleagues at Scottish Government. Yeah, who's best to come in on this one?
Again, I'm happy to have a go if, but any of my colleagues, please shut up. I mean, again, a really good question. It's one that you know, it has come up. So basically, the none of the treaties that we are looking to implement or bring into law, rather, contain a definition of women. Or like CEDAW, you know, so we're not looking to kind of create our own definition of women for the bill. We, you know, given that we'll be like I say, removing text in terms of reserved UK government law, I believe that's in the Equalities Act at UK government level. So that would not change essentially. I mean, that's the kind of short answer. Is that like helpful? Is there?
Yeah, I just a question that's always stuck with me over the last year, especially reading that. It says if I've taken it from the wording of the current UN conventions, and the UN conventions are written in 1949, they will be specifically biological. What we're talking about is more psychological effects of gender. So how would that affect the running of decisions in the court?
I mean, David, that's a really good question. I mean, the consultation doesn't go really into that level of detail, I'm afraid, but it's certainly something that we'd be keen to get your thoughts on. I mean, I suppose it's a good opportunity to talk more broadly about the function of guidance that we're looking to introduce in the bill and how that relates to giving effect to specific rights within the equalities treaties. So there's a sort of a, you know, we're mindful, and there's some this is in the consultation kind of across it, of the role of public participation in informing different aspects of the bill, how it's implemented, how things like guidance are prepared, and even right down to things like, is there kind of a public role in local authorities doing things like making key decisions, setting budgets. So there's something about the overall aim of this bill, strengthening the system's kind of support for public participation in more aspects of the sort of systems that enable us to access our human rights. So I think to answer your question, I think that those are the types of questions where the bill consultation certainly doesn't have much specific to say, but what I would want to sketch out for you is that picture of, well, where that's actually kind of where the need for those discussions are coming in daily life, and we would hope the bill supports like a more inclusive conversation around that. That, you know, so I hope that's helpful.
I just wanted to come in, if possible, just on that. We want the Human Rights Bill, the Human Rights Act, once it's enforced, to be a living, breathing thing that's like live to you know, the changing political, social, cultural aspects of Scotland. So if there, and also it's not a silo, you know, bill. We're not trying to do, you know, start from scratch. What we're trying to do is build on the rights that already exist in Scotland, that are already there. So what we would hope is that the interpretation of the Act, the interpretation and implementation of the Act by duty bearers, by courts in those types of circumstances, would align with the current political and social understanding of things like gender, race, other types of context. So it would be a very live, we would hope that it would be a very live interpretation in terms of its implementation. And would align with the current, you know, whether it's political or social thinking at the time. So we would hope that it would be that they would develop in that way. But we are using, in terms of getting the bill, you know, signed off and through Parliament, we're using the language of the treaties as a starting point. But we do hope that it would be a living, you know, kind of breathing thing which evolves with use as Scotland and its thinking evolves. I hope that helps.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Kiren. I think that was it's a really good question, and I think that was a really good answer. So thank you. I'm going to multitask here because I see there's a question or a comment potentially from Claudia, but we also have a kind of poll to put up. And I'm also conscious of the time and that we're running a wee bit over. So if we launch the poll and people can just answer that whilst I bring in Claudia to ask her question or make her point. Hi, Claudia.
Hi there. Two things. One, by changing or taking out the wording with regard to reserved matters, does that not change the nature of the treaty? And or the completeness, the contents. That's one. But the other one is there are lots of good stuff in there, a lot of which will require funding or resources or additional resources. And you were talking about targeting resources, but of course, where does the extra funding come from?
Right, thanks, Claudia. Who's coming in on this one or on those two questions?
So,
oh, sorry, go for it, Becky.
yeah, just your first point there, Claudia, about removing references to matters which are reserved to Westminster. We don't believe that it changes the content of the treaties. This isn't currently in domestic law, but we are signatory to these treaties, so they do exist in that, you know, in this space, if you like. But we don't believe that removing things that are reserved changes the nature of the treaty, because if they're reserved, they're already in law. For example, the Equality Act and the Equal Opportunities Reservation. So I hope that answers your first question. But your second question, perhaps I can go back to Joe, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. Yeah, so absolutely, Claudia, a great question. Where is the money coming from? And it's absolutely something that we've been hearing in other spaces as well. So it's, I mean, as you'll see, there's no specifics around resourcing in the consultation proposals. So I think a useful space to look for those, if you look at the UNCRC bill, there was a financial memorandum produced on that, which set out the Scottish Government's initial ideas on how that bill would be funded. So the sort of point where we talk about what resources are maybe needed to kind of front load the bill's implementation are coming and will be set out in that document. And you know, if you look at that document, it talks about things like information awareness campaign, resources for duty bearers to do that capacity building work. But more generally, I think it's worth flagging that the sort of like overarching intent of this bill is to create much more levers for casting light on the system, as it were, and identifying where there are sort of ongoing or systemic human rights issues that and that in itself, if we think about things like you know, the sort of incentives and disincentives on actors within the system, on duty bearers who have new sort of clearly established in law legal requirements, on frontline services who will have new kind of training and education around their human rights function, and even on all the way up to on the courts, certainly, and even on like Scottish ministers through that sort of transparency of the human rights scheme. All of these things are going to be new drivers of the current system of where resource goes. So it's something that we would very much hope to see evidence of over time, is how the bill's impact is driving resource towards human rights, better human rights outcomes for people. So I hope that that two-parted answer, details to come, but also the overall kind of thrust of this bill is very much about putting resource where it should be going. I hope that helps.
Great, right, thanks very much. So that's hopefully the poll launched for folk. If you could just fill that in, if you don't mind. I just obviously like to say thank you to our speakers from Scottish Government for, I think, it's quite a difficult job to kind of summarise it in the 40 minutes that we had today, although we pushed on a little bit from that. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to colleagues for joining us also. We will be sending out an email after this session that'll have some useful and helpful links, and also obviously to the consultation. And we would encourage you to submit your own consultation response so that government is seeing that diverse range of views and experiences that they can incorporate in to make this a stronger bill, stronger legislation, stronger act. So on that note, I will wish you a good day. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully see you soon. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.